Joel Armin-Hoiland, the founder and CEO of Climate Finance Solutions, is back to tell us about the EU Innovation Fund.
The EU Innovation Fund is pretty exciting. It's really one of the largest climate funding programs in the entire world. Those are really focusing on deep decarbonization of the sectors, but there's also funding for manufacturing, renewables, energy storage.
It's not just any industrial development. This aims to fund technologies that help bolster their industrial base while also reducing GHG emissions.
The degree of innovation is really important. Obviously, you need to be demonstrating a transformative technology and that really has a step change beyond whatever the current solutions are. This is probably going to be, to date, the most scrutinized grant application that they'll have submitted.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the CleanTechies podcast. I'm Silas Maynor, your favorite clean tech headhunter. All right, we are back today with another special episode of CleanTechies. Joel Armin-Hoiland, the founder and CEO of Climate Finance Solutions, is back to tell us about the EU Innovation Fund, a 40 billion euro fund of grant opportunities that is being deployed over many years to help spur innovation in the industrial space. But it's not just any industrial development. This aims to fund technologies that help bolster their industrial base while also reducing GHG emissions. So Joel actually came on the pod recently. You can check out that episode number 258, where he broke down the critical minerals funding opportunities from the DOE. Definitely go check that out if you have not already heard it. And if you're not familiar with Joel, just a quick background, his company, Climate Finance Solutions, is the person or is the company to call whenever you are trying to land non-dilutive grant funding opportunities. They have helped secure $1.6 billion in funding since 2020. So they definitely know what they're doing. If you need an expert, you want to land some non-dilutive funding, you want to preserve that precious equity, reach out to Joel and his team. Okay, before the show starts, don't forget to mark your calendars for December 10th and 11th at the Hack Summit, which is returning to New Lab in New York City. This summit brings together 500 founders, funders, and industry leaders in climate deep tech. We will be at the summit making content because why not? Many of the featured speakers and panelists are our past podcast guests. We've got people like Cody from Brimstone, Ted Feldman from Durin, Liz Dennett from Endolith, Augustus DeRico from Rainmaker, and many more. Please join us. You can get a 10% discount if you sign up using the link in the description. We hope to see you there. And of course, before we start, shout out to Earth Tech Talent for sponsoring this episode. Yes, that is my company, but I have to plug it because after all, it's the main thing keeping this show funded. So if you are a clean tech startup looking to hire top tier executive, sales, or hardware engineering talent, reach out today. I've been doing this for almost 6 years now with about 80 placements in total. And on top of that, we also charge roughly half the price of other firms, because we really care about efficiency. So reach out to me directly to get started. All right, enjoy the show. All right, welcome back to the pod, Joel. How you doing? Long time no see.
I know, it's been a minute. It's good to see you.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a record for us. I mean, you'll have been on the pod 3 times in a row, technically, not in a row, but within the course of like a month and a half or 2 months. So this is great. I mean, obviously you guys provide a lot of value. So for anybody who's not familiar, I'll just give a quick reintroduction. So we're with Joel today, and he runs Climate Finance Solutions. I'll let him explain that in a second. But if you did want to listen to the first episode that we did with him, it's episode 258, and he was breaking down the DOE's funding of the critical minerals projects that they're working on, or I should say continuation of some of the projects that were already in the IRA that were retained with the OB cubed bill. So, and then he also came on our live podcast in New York, which if you heard, you know that you're either there or you heard that the audio quality was crap. Apologies for that one, but he was also on that episode. So why don't you just give a reintroduction of what you guys do at Climate Finance Solutions for anybody unfamiliar?
Yeah, so we are a consulting firm that helps climate-related companies and organizations secure large-scale, non-dilutive government funding. So that's mostly grants, but we've also done quite a bit of incentives and tax credits and subsidies, as well as some government-secured debt as well. We do have, as I said, a large-scale focus. So kind of for the purposes of this conversation around Innovation Fund, we've done a lot of these large-scale first-of-a-kind demonstrations and a lot of grants in the high tens and hundreds of millions of dollars and euros. We're climate-focused, but sector-agnostic, worked in pretty much all industry verticals related to climate, certainly all the ones under Innovation Fund. And we provide services throughout the full funding life cycle. So everything from funding identification and assessment, funding strategy, funder engagement, proposal development, obviously, and not just kind of working with clients to take something they fully figured out and write it down, but really work with them to understand their technology roadmap, their pathway to commercialization and scale, and be kind of a thought partner in terms of developing project design, project scoping, strategic partnership development, consortium building as well, that are really especially important with these particular, these larger funding opportunities. And then we offer post-award management services as well.
Got it. So in general, if you're a climate tech company and you want non-dilutive funding, you should probably talk to you and you'll help them out.
I should say so.
So again, I do recommend anybody going and checking out that first episode we did if you want to hear more in more detail about what Joel does. But today we're going to be talking about the EU Innovation Fund. So this is, if I understand correctly, you can intro this here, but this is something that's relatively new within the EU, and you guys are doing a lot of work to help people access this capital. So maybe just give us start off with educating me a little bit, because this is very new to me. I spend most of my time in the US. Help me understand what exactly is the EU Innovation Fund, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, so the EU Innovation Fund is pretty exciting. It's really one of the largest climate funding programs in the entire world. I think a key thing to understand about it, it's really for deployment, not R&D. So they're really looking for first of a kind, near commercial technologies that are low carbon and are net zero, as they call it. It's a 40 billion euro fund from the sale allowances from their emissions trading system. That 40 billion will be dispersed over between 2020 and 2030, and they've only granted 7.2 billion so far. So they definitely need, we're halfway through the decade, so they're going to be accelerating that for sure. For 2025, we're expecting about 5.5 billion in a single call that will be released probably December of this year. That's typically when they release it on an annual basis. And we're probably looking at a deadline around April of 2026 if the past is any guide. Again, they're looking for these kind of commercial deployments, large scale demonstrations, except for one pilot category. There isn't a specific hard TRL requirement, but generally technologies that are applied to this program, even though they're innovative, are typically at least TRL 7 to 9. You really have to have some sort of proven pilot and technical maturity in order to apply. And then you also need not just technical maturity, but for the project itself, you have to show financial and operational maturity as well. So that's really important. In terms of the technologies that they're looking at, the most heavily regulated sectors under the emissions trading system, what they call energy intensive sectors like steel, cement, chemicals, refineries, pulp, fertilizers. Those are like really focusing on deep decarbonization of those sectors. But there's also funding for manufacturing, renewables, energy storage, CCUS, that's carbon capture, utilization and storage, hydrogen, some transportation like maritime and aviation technology. So pretty wide range of technologies actually, but they do have some technologies that they maybe kind of favor a bit or fund more over others. And those are kind of those energy intensive sectors. What we've been hearing about this upcoming call is it's kind of divided into different sections. So there's 2.5 billion euros that's going to be dedicated to what they call net zero technology. So that's kind of like the full range of technologies that I just mentioned. They also have a separate call for battery recycling and manufacturing. Obviously, a really big emphasis on that, both here and in the US. And then they have what are called auctions, these dedicated auctions for industrial heat and hydrogen. Those are going to be about $1 billion each, or €1 billion each rather.
Oh, yeah. We should probably make sure we get used to saying that today.
I now that we do a ton of work in Europe, I go back and forth and mess it up no matter what context we're in.
It always confuses me, that's for sure. With these projects, I mean, usually we've talked about pretty much startups the whole time here, but are there any particular roles that VCs should play in this or should consider, like with this fund, even maybe just private investors in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think with VCs and investors, like the clearest direct role that they can play in these actual projects is providing co-financing, right? And in many cases, what we see is VCs and other investors writing what we call contingent commitment letters, right? So we commit to providing X funds contingent upon the award being, with this grant being awarded to this. So that's a very easy way to like provide a lot of value to your portfolio companies while also not having to commit anything that's not like super de-risked, right? I think, earlier on, just encouraging portfolio companies to assess innovation fund fit early. And if they're not ready for that, to consider other programs. I mean, I think that some investors, and I think a lot of investors are kind of getting more wise to this, but like non-dilutive funding is a way to de-risk your investment,
Hmm.
right? The way the really stringent evaluation that the government goes through is a validation of technology readiness, right? It enables them to leverage private capital 5, 10 plus times than what it can with other forms of capital, right? So just it's not competing with equity dollars. It's extremely complementary, and they're complementary both ways, obviously. I think the another way that the investors should think about this is they should, not just with innovation fund, but with grants in general, is like thinking about how to have companies be grant ready and build grant
Hmm.
readiness into milestones as you were discussing with like the different series, right? Especially if it's a company that is going to have like hard tech or like large scale installations. Like if you're an investor, you want them to be able to understand the regulatory environment. You want them to have permits. You want them to have an MRV plan. These are the exact things that are important for innovation fund and other grants. So, helping companies think, encouraging them to explore this type of non-dilutive funding, especially large scale non-dilutive funding, and then helping them with, at the very least, encouraging them to think through even if they're not actually like going through the process themselves.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. Do you find a difference typically between U.S. and European VCs on this front that are more or less familiar with the grant funding side of things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously like the last few years under the Biden administration, there was a ton of money. It's not to say there haven't been grant programs in the United States for a long time. There definitely have, but the European non-dilutive funding space is just much more well developed, and I think that VCs and investors are much more used to companies kind of coming out of, especially with national programs. Usually the EU provides larger scale funding opportunities, but in many cases, there's like fairly non-competitive national funding that companies can get at earlier stages. And so it's a much more kind of well trodden path, I think. But I think, all investors could, most investors could do a better job of supporting their companies and securing grant funding, or at least
Mhm.
thinking about how to secure non-dilutive funding.
Yeah. Hiring is a pain. Posting jobs usually means a pile of low quality applicants to sort through, but going out and finding them yourself also takes a long time, and it's also something you're not trained to do. But using a headhunter to save you time is often too expensive, but not anymore. Earth Tech Talent works specifically with early stage clean tech startups to hire the best talent so you can hit your next milestone. We work at prices that even a pre seed startup can afford. Yes, you heard that right. If you're a pre seed startup, you can afford our fees. Save yourself time and money on your recruitment by reaching out today. And the best part is, we actually offer a hiring guarantee. If the candidate is not the right fit, you will get your money back. So we have a very strong incentive to get it right the first time. To get in touch, reach out to me directly on LinkedIn or go to earthtechtalent.com. That's Earth, ERTH, techtalent.com to get into contact and learn more. All right, happy hunting. So just I wanted to pause quickly to go back. So you called it calls, and then there's also something that's an auction. So can we just maybe break down the differences there if it's important?
A call is basically what they would is the term for what we in the United States would we say solicitation or
Okay.
funding opportunity announcement or notice of
Okay.
funding opportunity. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways to say it in the United States as well, but in Europe, typically they'll call grant opportunities calls. These auctions are actually like a totally different mechanism. So there's two, as I mentioned, one for hydrogen and one for industrial heat. The hydrogen one actually was introduced in not last year, but the year before, so 2023. And it's for specifically for renewable hydrogen production that happens in the EU. And then this new one that'll be this year for the first time is industrial heat. So decarbonized heat in industrial context. So like electrification, industrial heat pumps, different fuel switching like hydrogen combustion, geothermal, renewable thermal, and basically the way that they work is projects go through a bidding process, which is why it's called an auction, for a per unit price. So it would be
Mm.
like for emissions avoidance for the industrial heat, or per unit of hydrogen. And then basically, as long as they are pre-qualified under a certain minimum quality criteria, you win if you have the lowest price. So it's really based on the lowest bidding price, as long as your technology and project meets the criteria, right? So that's very different from grants, right? They are looking at multivariate scoring, greenhouse gas emissions, innovative degree of innovation, replicability, but a lot of other things. Although they do also look at cost efficiency, and so that's two very different mechanisms. I think the other thing for folks to understand, if they're kind of hydrogen projects, for example, and in industrial heat decarbonization, those technologies can choose whether to go into the normal call or into the auctions. And I think one thing that's important for folks to know is that the payment schedules are very different, right? So like with an auction, you bid and then you receive the funds after verified delivery, so after operation. Whereas with the grants, you receive some upfront and then you receive them kind of throughout the project based on milestones.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Okay. So in general, the auctions are going to favor probably the most developed technology, the technology that has, I guess, not necessarily most developed, but the one that at least has the most proven ability to be cheaper. And that's meant to be merit based because you want the best. And are they then basically off taking the hydrogen, or are they just saying, hey, we're going to give you, like, after you've sold the hydrogen or after you've produced the hydrogen, we're going to give you this money for that? Can you explain the mechanism there?
Yeah, so the mechanism is basically, you can think of it as a per unit payment for the social good of that being produced.
Okay. I just maybe to push back, I'm just kind of curious, like, maybe if you don't want to weigh into this too much, we can skip it. But if they have the ability to produce, like, say, for example, green hydrogen, cost effectively at that level, wouldn't they already have commercial offtakes for it?
Well, I mean, I think they're also trying to create a market to some
I see.
degree, right? So they're also creating these mechanisms for both procurement, and it also creates some market certainty that enables other participants on the other side of the market to understand, okay, there's going to be a certain volume at a certain price with a certain quality that the EU has basically given their stamp of approval and said, yes, these projects are qualified. So it's like market creation and efficient procurement as well.
Okay, interesting. Just out of curiosity, do you know if this particular method has been done in the past and if we've seen any particular success with this method to create markets?
Yeah, so I mean the hydrogen, this will be the third time that the hydrogen auction has happened just under the Innovation Fund. And it was pretty successful both in 2023 and 2024. And the EU actually has used, it's not super common in the US, but the EU has used auctions with other types of technologies in the past. So I think, they are making a really big policy push into industrial decarbonization generally. And so I think they're seeing, I think you're actually right on target by saying, these technologies will probably be more mature, obviously more able to compete on price. And so they'll be, so they have seen success with kind of being able to push technologies both on the kind of mature and cost competitive side versus some that may be a little more innovative on the grant side.
So, and then just to clarify, is this something that will happen again next year so that companies are investing into the technology now because they know, hey, if we can get to this point, we're going to receive it? Do you have any idea on the timelines there for the continued future auctions?
So, I mean, these auctions are for multi-year commitments, but
Okay,
it's, given that the hydrogen auction this is the third time it's happening, it
I see.
seems pretty likely that will continue. And, with the industrial decarbonization push in the EU, it seems very likely, unless there's some disaster, that the industrial heat one will also continue.
Okay, got it. And then again, I hate to keep going back, but I just want to make sure I got this correct. You said that they're funding the EU Innovation Fund through what? What's the funding mechanism that they were able to get the money for this?
Yes. So the emissions trading system is the EU's emissions compliance market,
Okay,
right? So rather than the voluntary compliance market, it's a EU. It's in all companies and entities are subject to emissions reduction requirements. So they have a certain amount of allowances, and they are slowly reducing the number of allowances that are available, and that way they're reducing the overall amount of emissions. But then, of course, on the other side, they're providing funding for these same
I see.
companies and entities to be able to develop, demonstrate, and test the technology that they actually need to comply with those emissions requirements. So they're
Got it.
actually doing it right. That's the right way to make to make climate policy. In the U.S., we've kind of just done the giving the money and not cramming down any emissions.
I see. And then I don't know if we were going to cover this later or not, but I just wanted to clarify the money in the case of the auctions will go to the technology provider, the person who's producing the outcomes. But
Correct.
what
Yeah.
about on the other side, the decarbonization side for the grants? Is that going to be going to the industrials who implement the technology, or is it going also again to the technology developer?
Yeah. So those will be spread across basically the entire partnership. So there will
Okay.
be, in almost every case, especially with the large scale funding opportunities, these are going to be large scale projects with at least several and sometimes more than several partners. And,
Okay.
the partners in the folks in the consortium kind of define the budget split and divvy up the budget
I
how
see.
they see fit in order to most effectively carry out the project. So those funds will be split between a variety of different entities.
Okay, got it. And then before we move on to successful applications, is there anything else that you wanted to cover before we move on to that phase about who should be considering this or who's eligible?
Yeah, I think it would be I think it kind of a key thing to understand with the innovation fund versus other types of EU funding. So there are some other EU funding opportunities that are open to non EU applicants, but an innovation fund is fairly unique in that it's really open to any entity from any company or any it's open to any entity from any country in the world, right? So lead applicants can be global entities, sub applicants can be global entities. The main rule is that the projects just have to be implemented within the EU
Hmm.
or EU economic area, right? And so the project site, the emissions reductions, the impacts, also the replicability and scalability plan also has to be located in Europe, right? These are all kind of key scoring mechanisms. But I mean, either way, even if you're an international company and you're the lead applicant, significant European partnerships are going to be required, right?
I
And
see.
so it's really about how you're constructing the consortium, how you're constructing the project team, but it does provide a pretty unique avenue for U.S. companies and other companies from other countries to secure pretty large scale funding within Europe without having to worry about and kind of go jump through some hoops that you may need to do with some other programs like Life or Horizon Europe.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Obviously, you guys have helped many companies secure lots of these types of grants. What is required to successfully apply and win one of these grants from your perspective?
Yeah. So these are very complicated. So there's a lot. I think the main thing is really, the evaluation is done via a pretty transparent point system. So the first thing is just in order to win, you need to understand the scoring criteria and be
Okay.
able to maximize your points, right? So there's like the main criterion is GHG avoidance, right? So you have to have like quantifiable emissions reductions. You want a clear reference scenario so that you can demonstrate that there are reductions. You need to make sure that your data sources are good. You've made clear assumptions. The degree of innovation is really important. Obviously, you need to be demonstrating a transformative technology and that really has a step change beyond whatever the current solutions are. I think replicability, scalability, and then cost effectiveness are both 10%, right? So replicability and scalability specifically within the EU, and then cost efficiency, similar to the auctions in that it's euros per tons of CO2 avoided. I think the last one that's probably the most complex element, and I think the thing that really puts projects over the top with kind of that 80-20 rule is the project maturity. So even though it's only 20% of the score, it's definitely the most difficult to achieve, and that's really where winning projects can differentiate themselves, right? So the way that they think about maturity is kind of on three levels, right? Technical, operational, and financial maturity. Technical maturity is kind of what we were talking about before in terms of the stage, right? You want technology that's been validated for your previous pilots or early commercial runs around TRL 7 and 9. Within that maturity, you have you're going to need a feed study or something that's equivalent for the plant and facility that you're building. You need a technical description that's extremely detailed and goes through the pilot and previous experience that you've
Mm.
had. On the financial maturity side, again, this is kind of like one level up in difficulty. You need to have a pretty credible financial model. These are long-term projects. The project terms are like 10 years, and you have like a 4-year ramp-up period. So this is not maybe some of the like 3 to 5 year projects where we think about in the US. They're much larger and longer, and you can actually have OpEx in there as well as CapEx. But you also need to make sure that you have like a very strong cost estimate basis for that capex and opex plan as well. And then with the co-financing, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, there you really need to have, if it's not already secured, you need to have like very credible commitments or written commitments from a variety, various co-financing sources to make sure that you can, or at least a plan to get them within that 4-year period. And then I think operational maturity, some of the stuff we've already been talking about, right? Like the partnerships are really a key element. To do one of these projects right, you're going to need, as you were saying, an industrial host or a site host where the project's going to occur. In many cases, these projects are going to be integrated with existing industrial systems or existing systems. So, they'll have that industrial host. You obviously need, a feedstock supplier if that's relevant for you, an off taker of whatever the product is. They generally want to see an EPC for large scale projects. So someone that they have confidence can actually build the project. And then of course the technology provider, which oftentimes are the entities that are kind of propelling and driving the projects forward. So you really need to have all these partners to demonstrate you're working within the supply chain, you understand that, and you have the ability to carry out that project.
Mm-hmm.
I think obviously we need to have site control with the industrial host, and I think that is something where that's a really difficult thing that for folks to get sometimes, especially international folks. And then permitting and regulatory readiness is another key element, because this is, a first of a kind project. This is something that not all technology providers are used to being that far advanced with permitting and regulatory readiness. So that's a really important element of demonstrating maturity as well, right?
Mm-hmm. I am super excited to share that we at CleanTechies are going to be making content at the upcoming Hack Summit in New York City. This is returning to New Lab December 10th and 11th. And here with me to tell us more about Hack Summit is Laura Hodgkiss from Climate Hack.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking the time to just break down a little bit more about this summit. A lot of people are not familiar. So in brief, can you just tell us what is Hack Summit?
Yes, absolutely. So we're really excited. Last year we came to New York for the first time, having hosted 5 events in Switzerland. We had a fantastic success, amazing people that were joining. It was investors, founders, corporates, CVCs and operators, all within the climate deep tech space, with a real enthusiasm and commitment to collaborate. And it's really a chance for everyone to come together. We want to accelerate more investment into climate deep tech, unlock those opportunities. We want more startups to be seen by investors, and investors and operators to find their next scale up partner, find new partnerships to grow, collaborations that spark at the Hack Summit, then go on to create great success.
Especially the focus on the deep tech side of things is really important, because it's very difficult to move these things forward. So Climate Hack is the organization that's putting this on. Could you tell us a little bit more about Climate Hack specifically?
Yeah, definitely. So Climate Hack is a global community. The team is based in Switzerland, but we have ambassadors who work all around the world with us, and they're putting on local free events in their communities. The aim is really to bring together people that could be students, it can be investors, startups, and founders coming together. And then throughout the year, we're writing different editorial content to connect the dots between investors and startups so that more people can understand what's going on, what are these technologies, and how can they get involved in the climate tech space. And the Hack Summit is really the occasion where everyone can come together twice a year now for the Hack Summit to be able to have those exchanges and get together.
Can you tell us a little bit more about who is going to be there? Any particular names you want to mention, or generally the type of people who will show up?
Yeah, definitely. So we have a wide range of founders working across the climate deep tech space, and they're going to be joining us for fireside chats with partners from the VCs that are backing them as well to uncover their journey. So, for example, we have Cody Fink, who is the co-founder and CEO of Brimstone. He's going to be joining Rachel Slabow, who's a partner at DCVC. And then we have, for example, Liz Dennett from Endolith, and she's going to be speaking to Deborah Zajak of SOSV to talk about her scale up and growth. And then also we can learn about what's happening at SOSV. We have Sampriti Bhattacharya, who is building America's first all-electric hydrofoiling vessel. And then I'm also personally excited about Laureen Meru, who's the founder and CEO of Hertha Metals. I'm sure you probably saw as well, she recently came out of stealth with 17 million. And now she's forging the future of steel.
Yeah, there's so many really fascinating companies. What are you most excited for about Hack Summit this year particularly?
It's a really exciting moment when you enter, and all of these incredible founders and these investors and these operators. It's that it's that real energy in the room, I think, that sets it apart from other conferences. The most senior partners from the VC funds or the Series B, Series C founders are really willing to talk to the earlier stage founders or make time for everyone. And I think that's really what the climate deep tech community is. It's really, really powerful.
Who should apply to come to the Hack Summit?
So the Hack Summit is the perfect event for founders that are fundraising. It's for investors that are looking to find what's new and next that's happening in the climate deep tech space. And it's also open for CVCs that are looking to partner with startups and operators that are working in the space. If they share our passion and excitement for scaling deep tech solutions, then they should be in the room.
And where can people apply to come to the Hack Summit?
So hacksummitny.com is the website to go. We've got the sign up there.
Yeah, it was as soon as I saw that this was happening, I was like, man, I have to go, because half of your main speakers have been on the podcast already. So it's a perfect fit for us. But no, I'm really excited for this, and I hope, just encourage everybody, if you have the opportunity, come to this summit to learn from founders who have already scaled to a very large extent. Maybe you need to learn from somebody who's further along, or you've got some lessons to share with other founders earlier in their journey. So apply to come today. You heard it. The link will be in the description, and we hope to see you there. Real quickly, when you mentioned site control with the industrial host, are you saying that the industrial host has to agree with you to work on it, or they have to relinquish control to you as the developer?
Yeah, site control just basically means that you have a commitment that from whoever owns the site, you maybe have a lease to it, or you have a written agreement from the folks that own or lease the site themselves, that you're able to operate the project for the full term in the manner that you have said you would be able to do that.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I just want to get that clarification. You were going to say something else.
Oh, I think this is the last thing, is just obviously, like, there's all of this is really important, and then there's kind of like the little cherry on top piece, which is the storytelling part, right? Like, you have to have like check all these boxes with the maturity and these different things. Even though it's very complicated, it's to some degree a box checking exercise. You also have to make sure that you're putting together a narrative, and not just necessarily the technical narrative, but every single document, even the technical documents within the application, kind of have to lead up and build up into a narrative that's like, why this technology, why now, and why us.
Yeah, I mean, think that's very fascinating. Probably why people should especially reach out to you guys to help them figure that out. This is interesting. So I did want to just maybe level set this. Does this mean, like, all those different requirements, does this mean that usually the startups who would get access to this type of thing, or who would win these types of things, would be past the Series A already, or like into the Series B round? Or is it pretty common that these companies, they have proven the technology with some demo plants, and they might be at Series A and ready to go to Series B? Like, do you see a pattern there?
Yeah, I mean, most are at Series A at least.
Okay.
Right. I mean, people are like getting 25 to 50 million Series A's now. So to some degree, it's like, there's less meaning.
Depends on
in
how
the,
you define
in the
Series A.
But I think, like, Series A to C is like pretty typical for technology providers. I think it really depends also on like the strength of the consortium, right? Like, if you're a Series B, C company, you can probably drive a lot of that yourself, even though you're still probably going to need an EPC. If you're a Series A company, you definitely see Series A companies kind of being the core technology provider. But what that means is you need a much stronger kind of set of partnerships to give the evaluators confidence that you'll be able to be operationally mature enough to carry out the project.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. This sounds really familiar too. It won't be published by the time this comes out, but another episode we did recently, where they talked about having the minimum viable ecosystem for your on your cap table. So if you have these kind of core people involved, you tend to have access to more resources. So that's quite interesting that this is coming up right back to back. I recorded that last week. So, okay, you mentioned earlier that this has to be a truly innovative technology. It can't just be some kind of like incremental thing. Are there definitions around what qualifies as innovative?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's important both because this is a big source of points, but it's also can be hard, I think, for companies that are making the transition from R&D grants to larger deployment grants or first of a kind grants, to kind of be able to thread that needle with innovativeness versus readiness for a folk project. So what they're really looking for are true first of a kind deployments or a breakthrough enabling technology. right? And so you need to show what they call a step change improvement in performance, cost, or scalability, ideally all of those. It has to be a novel application or a novel integration in a specific, new industrial use case. And then I think the other element is that really, I think especially for storytelling, you really need to be able to demonstrate the potential for sectoral transformation. They're not looking to fund one-off projects. They're looking for projects that provide a first-of-a-kind demonstration that will catalyze an industry and be able to be replicable and scalable across Europe and even beyond, right? So you have to be mature to a certain degree, but if you're just applying a specific technology to a new use case, that's not going to be enough, right? And
Yeah.
I think the other thing is that you have to really benchmark the gains against state of the art. So you can't just say, oh yeah, it's like way better. You have to have like a quantifiable benefit on those, with those different metrics, right? None of it can be hand wavy. For most people, this is probably going to be, to date, the most scrutinized grant application that they'll have submitted.
Hmm. That makes sense. Yeah, I think it's also I like the idea that it has to transform the entire industry because that sets a certain bar that's like why would we fund this in the first place if it's not going to? And
Mm-hmm.
if it is, like we're really kind of giving a boost here. And if this is so transformative, then it would probably, startups wouldn't like to hear this, but it would probably follow that many imitators will come in and try to replicate the technology because you're not going to have one company usually have the only new technology that's going to change things. Other people would want to
Right.
compete with it, right? So it would then bring in more money to that space. So I like that. That's very fascinating. I think from a policymaking perspective, definitely got to give the EU some props there. It seems like they've done a pretty good job of defining this. Anything else you want to cover there before we move on to a couple other items about the financing?
No, I think that covers it for
Cool.
innovation.
So you mentioned earlier that they have to have co-financing lined up. Can you talk a little bit more about what that typically looks like and how startups secure that?
Yeah. So specifically, the innovation fund covers up to 60% of relevant costs, right? So relevant, there's a kind of formula to determine that. That's generally OPEX, eligible CAPEX, OPEX, and other direct costs. So applicants have to come up with 40% of those relevant costs, and that can be a lot, right? If you're applying, like, we did an application last year for, a project that was over 350 million euros total, and we asked for over 150 million euros. So obviously that's a lot of co-financing. That's more than 40%, but, on 150 million, 40% is pretty sizable. So, typically that co-financing comes from a pretty wide range of sources and oftentimes multiple sources at once. So we've seen capital stacks typically will include some form of equity, whether that's from like existing VCs or new VCs or corporate. It's actually not super uncommon for the industrial host to come in and either provide equity into, the top co or a different company. Debt, especially for obviously these really big projects, can be really important. So that can be commercial debt, that can sometimes be national or even EU backed loans. There are different ways of getting national or regional support. So these could be other forms of national grants, other forms of subsidies, and other elements that are aligned with the innovation fund rules that are allowable to be used as cost share. You can also use offtake and revenue contracts actually as cost share. So if you're going to be securing funding throughout the life of the project, you'll be able, so if you have like purchase agreements or carbon credits, you can sometimes in certain ways use those as, to make up the capital stack. And again, you're usually stacking multiple different types of funding along
Mhm.
with the grant.
Do you find that it's really difficult for founders to wrap their head around all of those different vehicles at this time because they probably haven't done a lot of these yet, or do they usually have decent familiarity?
I think that founders that have gotten their companies to a place where they're ready for a true first of a kind commercial deployment have probably interacted with most of these types of capital. This may just be at a larger scale than they've done before, but I think what folks find is that the innovation fund grant is a really good lever to actually get them into kind of the next echelon of these these types
Mm-hmm.
of funding. But yeah, I mean, it's really complicated. And I think because founders and founding teams are often, on the technical side, and this is something that's said a lot when you're having folk conversations, but, it's really important to be looking ahead to folk if that is the kind of, if your technology is something where you're going to have to be building large projects. And it's also important to bring people onto, if not your founding team, into your C-suite that
Yeah.
have experience with all these different types of capital at the right scale in order to pursue these projects. Because whether or not you're going after the innovation fund, if you want to be successful at this stage,
Either way.
you're going to have to leverage all these types of capital anyway.
Yeah, that's really valuable. I think definitely make sure if you're a founder, put on your thinking hat when it comes to who's going to be involved in your advisory, on your cap table when you're doing these things, because there's going to be so many things, especially if you're a first-time founder, that you are just not going to know. And the small nuances of those deal structures, I'm assuming, again, I've never been the one in these rooms, but from what I've heard, I'm assuming that the nuances really matter in those deals.
Yep.
Okay, got it. So we already talked about the fact that this is open to non-European entities as long as you have European focus on the projects and a host. Obviously applying to these projects in the first place sounds like super complicated. So what is typically the timeline that somebody should start planning that, hey, I'm gonna plan for 2026 application. When do I start working on that?
Yep. So again, the timeline that we're looking at in terms of the actual call being released, probably sometime in December of this year, and then with a deadline in April. So a lot of folks think, okay, we have just between December and April to put this together. Great, that's a long time to put together a grant. I think in general, for a normal grant that's maybe in like the single digit millions or low tens, that could be accurate. But for this scale of grant and a grant at this type of complexity, you have to start before the call is open. We're actually working with multiple companies right now in mid-October as we're recording this. You need to be doing a lot of different things now, especially at the very least scoping the project to see is this something that makes sense for you at all, or this year, obviously with such a major focus on maturity that they have. There are also a bunch of really long lead items with these types of projects, right? There's the site host, getting that site, understanding whether the grid or heat interconnections or whether infrastructure there is going to be sufficient. There's understanding environmental impact assessments that have to be done prior to, or at least during the application process. There's the permitting and regulatory elements that I talked about before that are going to be much more stringent than for an R&D grant. There's obviously like all the offtake MOUs and industrial host letters and co-financing letters. You're going to need some sort of TEA and LC, so techno-economic analysis and life cycle analysis. And then of course, like all the documentation for the capital stack and co-financing. And, those are just probably the longest lead items that initially come to mind, but there are others as well. I guess I would probably put greenhouse gas modeling and, and financial planning in there as well.
And for a lot of those, I would assume it's pretty frequent that you're going to need external consultants to pull those things together, correct?
Yeah. So at least some of those, like most companies don't have, internal ability to do environmental impact assessments. A lot of them don't have the ability to do like as much permitting regulatory work as they need to do in these specific areas. TEA, LCA, a lot of companies kind of have that, but there's a lot that goes into it that, folks need to be preparing now. At the very least right now, preparing to put these things together. At the very least to have a line of sight on how they're going to be able to do that. And if they do have one of those large projects, like, there are multiple project categories. If they're in the large projects, which are minimum 100 million CapEx, you need to be preparing that now, or you're just not going to be able to do it.
Everything together.
Starting in December.
Yeah. Got it. So if I get this in general, the larger the project, the more lead time you want. And in the cases that we're talking about with a lot of these projects, which are again usually north of 100 million euros, they will want to, and those are, again, this is just for the current ones that we're talking about. Those are deadline in April. They should be working on them already in October.
Yeah. I mean, there are different project categories. So the largest project category is 100 million plus.
Okay.
There's a medium size, which is 20 to 100, and then there's a small size, which is 2.5 to 20. So
Okay.
it's a pretty wide range there, obviously. And the smaller it is, like the less complex it is going to be put together, although the application requirements are the same in terms of the documentation.
Yeah.
There's also a pilot category, which is 2.5 to 40. And instead of being a 10-year period, those are like a 3-year period. Those are to actually, it's called a pilot because you do a pilot rather than doing a near commercial demonstration that's based on a pilot. But the majority of funds do not go there. Most of them
Got it.
go to these near commercial
Okay.
deployments.
What are the, I guess, biggest pitfalls or misconceptions that people typically fall into in this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of things that can go wrong with any grant application. I think that this one is more complex and there's just more elements. And so, we've heard stories of people getting disqualified by like not using the relevant cost calculator correctly, these are the easiest ways to get DQ'd, right? Getting the budget wrong, not calculating relevant costs correctly, which is like what you base the 60% on. The greenhouse gas methodology is really important too. They take a really, really close look at that, right? So you need a really strong reference case to demonstrate the delta between where you're going to be with the project and where you are starting from. You need really strong data. You need, at the very least, really highly defensible assumptions. For that, you also need to be very careful how you cite pilot data and not like extrapolate too far in what you're doing there. I think the other thing, as I mentioned, just issues with maturity, I think that's just the main thing that you can really win or lose in that last 20%. And I think what we've seen actually a lot is people kind of coming to us even before the call is released. We talk to them about it and it's like, you know what, you guys are going to be super ready next year. And so let's take the next year to talk about this and get ready. And there's a couple folks that we're probably going to work with on this call that we've been talking to you for over a year. It doesn't mean that you aren't necessarily ready now. I think it's important to kind of do that exploration, but you don't want to go into this if you're like missing site control or missing permits, or you don't have a financing plan, right? And you don't have like a credible team or EPC or plan for near-term execution.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. No, I think that's interesting. On this, as you're pointing out some of these things, like I haven't spent a lot of time, especially recently on the podcast, talking about the European ecosystem here, but I'm just kind of curious. They seem to be really focused broadly on building out their industrial strategy, if you will. And we obviously talked about this at Climate Week in general, but do you see this fund being more of a policy instrument or tool? And I guess just what are your core takeaways from as you see these types of things playing out and how Europe's doing it well and what maybe the US could learn from it?
Yeah, I mean, Innovation Fund is interesting. It's kind of like the harbinger of the way that, it was when it was created a few years ago, it's kind of the harbinger of the way that the EU is going now, right? It's like they just announced earlier this year, and they've kind of been working on this, as you point out, for a while, that they're going to be using industrial decarbonization as a real lever, especially in this kind of more competitive geopolitical environment, a real lever for economic growth, right? And so they're going to be focusing on competitiveness, industrial competitiveness, scale up funding, developing large scale infrastructure, both with Innovation Fund, and they're also talking about creating even larger kind of umbrella funds that are, the competitiveness fund, they're potentially going to be calling it. They have what they just put in February, what they call the Clean Industrial Deal. The centerpiece of that is kind of their answer to the Loan Programs Office here in the US, which is a $100 billion clean industrial bank that will provide grants, but also loans, loan guarantees, and blended finance for industrial decarbonization, these large-scale industrial decarbonization projects. And obviously that's much larger than Innovation Fund. They're talking about adding more funding to Innovation Fund. So they're really going all in with the type of funding that they're doing here with the Innovation Fund. And I think that Europeans do a good job of kind of holding that duality in their minds and thinking of, so obviously like greenhouse gas emissions is 40% of your score with Innovation Fund, at least for the grant portion of it. So that is the biggest element that they're looking at, and that's kind of table stakes for this. But as industrial policy, it's also really important that you're going into the value chain, you're having replicability and scalability. So they want to both kind of capture, cut emissions and also capture market share with their their industry simultaneously. So,
Mm.
I mean, I think it's a good lesson, I think, globally and for the US, that it's not like climate versus economy. It's like, I think as most of the people who work in the climate sector understand, like, this is the forefront of technology and cheap
Yes.
energy. It's not just quote unquote sustainability. It's the economy.
Yeah, it's the economy, stupid, right? I think this is interesting. I guess I am interested to see if you have any takes on this, but as you're talking through this, it's making me kind of compare, why doesn't the US have these types of projects that are funding the innovation, right? Like this is a government funded type of thing, right? And it's kind of the stick versus the carrot in the US. So do you have perspectives on one hand, we've got the EU who does a lot of, or at least it's very good at this policy stuff, it seems, and creating what seem to be pretty good incentive programs, right, to continue the investment there. And then on the US side of things, we could compare the innovation fund to the IRA, but I think that would be an unfair comparison because it feels to me that the US also has a very different dynamic on the just innovation is in our blood anyways. So we've got such a large VC ecosystem that does that kind of make up for it because it's all focused on just market forces purely and that's it. And that's why the government doesn't play as much of a role. Like when you look at these two kind of differences, what are the core things that you look at? And do you think the US really needs something like this ideally? Or will we be fine with just the pure market based VC approach?
Yeah. I mean, frankly, it's mostly political. I think that if we had, if rather than, the European elections, both national and for the European Parliament, like they're kind of discussing degrees of, oh well, I believe in these climate technologies, but I believe in like this other subset of those climate technologies. Whereas here, we're like, is it real or is it not real? And so there's almost like a
It's a different
ceiling
discussion.
on, it's a different discussion. It's almost a ceiling on what we can do. Like the idea that we could have an emissions trading system here in the United States is almost like is fanciful at this
Mm-hmm.
point, right? And that's kind of what it is required to. You need to have emissions caps that are stringent and dropping, and you need to have these funding programs that are coming up from the bottom and supporting the technology deployment and development. But I think to your point about there being differences between the US and other differences in terms of like the funding mechanisms, I think the IRA got closer to this, right? Because it had a lot of tax credits that were involved in the IRA, many of which were actually not as many of which were maybe like done away with the last big reconciliation bills we may have expected. Some of that is, you might call that something similar. It's not exactly the same mechanism, but it's like least cost, performance based metric market pull dynamics. The DOE Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, or OSED, was basically like the Innovation Fund. It
Mm.
was first of a kind, large scale commercial demonstrations, and obviously they've shut that down. So there was definitely some, there were some comps there, but Europeans are, it's more based on kind of competitive evaluations, obviously a lot more focus on CO2 metrics, and then a more like well thought out full scale industrial policy that the US just can't do because of politics.
Yeah. From your perspective, though, with the EU's focus on these different policymaking or these funds that they put together, is it so? Are they mostly focused on the emissions piece, or do they also have pretty strong focus on saying, "Hey, we really need to like build up our own industrial base, especially after some of the war and other items that they're seeing," or is it mostly focused on the emissions piece?
Yeah, I think it's changing. I think for a long time it was focused on the emissions piece, and then there was a report that came out like a couple of years ago that was like, actually, we need to be way more competitive. We're in this
Mm.
new geopolitical space, and the way that we're spending the funds on public funding is actually not leading to the competitiveness that we need. And that was really kind of the catalyst for making this change
Mm.
to competitiveness, scale, later stage, larger scale infrastructure that they're
Hmm.
making.
Yeah, that's interesting to see. Yeah, because I'm just especially thinking now. We talked a lot about this, or I talked a lot about this during Climate Week. We didn't necessarily talk too much about it on the live pod, but the fact that because of bad policymaking now in the U.S. and the rapid development of AI data centers, energy prices are just going to go through the roof, which will lead to more clean technology deployments, anyways,
Mm-hmm.
for various reasons. I won't get into it now, but it's interesting that this bad policy on one side will drive adoption, and on the other side we got good policy driving adoption, right? Just two similar outcomes, but obviously different reasons why we got there. So I think that's enough for today. Anything else that you wanted to cover that we missed, other than where people should reach you?
No, I think, obviously we do a lot of work in Europe. We have done a lot of these funding opportunities. We specialize in these large scale demonstrations. So folks should feel free to reach out to us if they have any questions or want to kind of go through a pre-scoping process. We're also doing like a webinar series. The first one it's going to be coming out, I guess, before this pod is released. So you can look on our social media for some webinars, but also just reach out directly.
Yeah. When are you publishing the webinar? When is the webinar?
It's this Thursday, so the recording and slides will be available the next day.
Yeah. This will be published next week. So, and what's your website? Just make sure people plug that.
ClimateFinanceSolutions.com.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming on again, Joel. Looking forward to seeing you again soon. I'm sure we'll have more of these to talk about.
Really looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it on social media and drop us 5 stars on your favorite podcasting platform. And we do have a really big favor. If you are a listener, please go and check out our YouTube channel. We are trying to grow on YouTube. If we get more engagement, follows, subscribes there, it will help with distribution and get this content in front of more people. So if you want to help us out, go to YouTube and become a subscriber today, comment on the last post, etc. We also love your feedback. So if you do have any feedback about the show in general, who you want to hear from in the future, just drop it in the comments of the Substack, of the YouTube, on LinkedIn, wherever you like, and or reach out to us directly. Especially if you got any negative feedback, any nasty stuff, keep it off the internet. Just send it directly to me. All right, thank you guys so much for tuning in. We will see you next time on CleanTechies.